Last year, I saved over 80% of my income, and in this video, I'm going to explain exactly how I did it. But first, let me explain why I'm even trying to save such a high percentage of my income. If you're new here, my name is Charles, and I'm trying to reach financial freedom before I turn 30 years old. And to show you how I'm managing to retire so quickly, I need to find a really long staircase. Most people take a very long path to financial freedom. Every single year, they save just 5 to 10% of their income and take just one step closer to financial freedom. And since they spend the other 90 to 95% of their income, they have to save millions of dollars to retire. Between taking very small steps and needing to go such a long way to reach financial freedom, most people spend their entire adult lives working. They spend 40 to 50 years of their lives just taking one small step at a time. I knew that I wasn't going to reach financial freedom by the time I turned 30 years old if I followed this traditional path. Instead, I knew that I had to live extremely frugally. And this actually has a couple of benefits. For one, saving 80% of my income every year means that I'm not just taking one step closer to financial freedom every year. Instead, every single year, I'm taking huge steps closer to financial freedom. But this isn't even the most important reason to live frugally. By living frugally, I also need a whole lot less money to be financially free. So in other words, I have a whole lot less stairs to climb. Because let's say that without any changes, somebody has to take 50 steps to reach financial freedom. So 50 years of work. But if they doubled their savings, they'd be taking 2 steps closer to financial freedom every single year instead of 1. But more importantly, if they cut their expenses in half, then they would only need to climb 25 steps to be financially free instead of 50. So they'd be saving way more money every year, but they would also need less money to retire. And this is the double benefit of living frugally. Not only am I climbing multiple steps every single year, I also have to climb a lot less steps to reach my goal. And this makes an enormous difference. The rule of thumb is that you need to save about 25 times your annual expenses in order to be financially free. But what this also means is that if you spend $1 less per year, then you also need $25 less in retirement savings. And this is how I help people become $10,000 to $100,000 closer to financial freedom. That's just the difference by reducing your waste by just about $1 to $10 per day. If you reduce your expenses by just $10 per day, which is not that hard, then every single year you'd be saving an extra $3,650. But on top of that, by reducing your expenses by that $3,650, you also reduced how much money you need to retire by $91,250. And I already said that I want to reach financial freedom by 30, which would just be an 8-year career. And this is how I'm able to do it. This is why I don't have to work 40 to 50 years. If I can save more money than most people, then I knew that I would hit my savings targets faster than most other people. And more importantly, I also knew that my savings targets could be way less because I would need way less money in order to retire. And this is how you retire extremely fast. The only way to retire in your 20s is to become extremely rich or to need very little. And it's a lot easier to need very little than it is to become extremely rich. So you now understand why I'm trying to save such a high percentage of my income. But now, let me break down how I'm actually doing it. And I'll talk about my income later, but let me start with just my expenses. Because at a super high level, there are only 4 saving strategies that I'm using to save over 80% of my income every year. And the most important factor in how much money you save every year is how much money you spend on housing. This is probably the most important financial decision that you'll ever make. If you make a bad decision here, then there is no way that you're going to be able to save 80% of your income. So here's what not to do. You absolutely want to avoid anybody telling you about here's how much house you can afford to buy or here's how much apartment you can afford to rent. Unfortunately, this seems to be the norm. Almost all of my friends from college graduated and immediately signed up for a 1-year lease for an apartment that cost thousands of dollars per month. And where I live, you could easily pay $3,000 to $4,000 for an apartment. Like seriously, that's not out of the ordinary. The apartments right behind me are going for that. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, The average American spends 35% of their income just on a place to live. You're obviously not going to save 80% of your income if you're already spending 35% of your income on a place to live. So don't try to afford your lifestyle. What you really want to do is minimize the cost of your lifestyle so you can get stupid rich and retire early. So I made a different decision than all of my friends. Instead of spending thousands of dollars per month on an apartment, I decided to just keep living like I was still in college. And no, that doesn't mean that I party every weekend. What I really mean is that I just kept living with roommates. Now, I still live in an extremely expensive area, so even just renting a room in a townhouse still means I'm spending $900 a month on rent. And that doesn't even include utilities, which average about $100 per month. So all total, last year I spent $11,983 on housing. But here's why that's such a big deal. To me, that's still a lot of money, but the average rent where I live is $3,500. You just can't save a huge percentage of your income if you're already spending a huge percentage of your income on housing. So living with roommates in a low-cost townhouse is literally saving me $30,000 per year compared to just the average rent in my area. Now, you can save a lot of money on just the little things, which I'll talk about later. But if you want to save a ridiculous amount of your income, then you have to be smart about where you live. But as important as housing is, it's still only about 35% of people's spending. So let's move on to the second strategy that I use to save 80% of my income, because this one saves me about as much money. Because in America, most people just assume that they need to drive a car. And honestly, I think most people never even consider it. For a long time, I didn't either. But if you really mapped it out and were very careful about where you chose to live, I think a lot more people could live car-free if they really wanted to. And that's exactly what I did. Now, to be fair, public transportation where I live is a lot better than almost everywhere else in the US. But to be honest, I hardly ever use it. I just carefully picked my apartment so that I was within walking or biking distance to my office, a grocery store, and my gym. That means that 95% of the time, I can just walk or bike to wherever I need to go. And yeah, sometimes I have to bike in bad weather, but that's totally worth it for the insane savings. Last year, I only spent $124.50 on transportation. And even if you count the 2 plane trips I took, I still barely spent over $1,000. But I don't even think that most people realize how important this is, because I don't think most people realize how much money they're spending here. Where I live, the average person is spending $13,582.28 per year just on transportation. And that's just the average for single people like me, which means that 50% of people spend even more than that, and families spend almost double that. That's absolutely insane, and it means that I'm saving about $12,500 extra dollars per year just by living car-free. And the last really big expense that almost everyone has is food. And honestly, this is where people are the most wasteful. And since people are so wasteful, the good news is that saving money here couldn't be any simpler. By far, the biggest cost of food is eating out, which I almost never do. And every time you go to the grocery store, you literally have hundreds of options. If you actually make it a priority, I can almost guarantee that you can find a cheaper alternative to almost everything that you normally eat. So while the average person in my area spent $8,233 on food, I spent just $2,256. That's another $6,000 in savings compared to the average single person in my area. So if you're keeping track, the average single person where I live is spending $63,815 on housing, transportation, and food. I'm spending $15,239 for those things. So yeah, you're probably seeing how I save 80% of my income. But there is just one more saving strategy that I use, which is honestly the simplest one. Because housing, transportation, and food are the only 3 expenses that you really need. So for literally everything else, I'm extremely minimalistic. Other than a kind of expensive gym membership, I basically buy the bare minimum for everything else. So altogether, last year I spent $20,045 in the entire year. And again, keep in mind that I do not live in a cheap area. In fact, the area that I live in is one of the most expensive counties in America. The estimated cost of living is $90,000 per year for a single person. But by doing everything that I talked about in this video, I'm spending $70,000 less than that. There's just such an extreme amount of flexibility in what most people spend every year. And again, this is how I help people reduce their expenses by thousands of dollars per year. And if you do that, you will probably be years closer to financial freedom. But for those interested, I did want to quickly break down my annual income too. Because obviously, you're not going to save a huge percentage of your income if you're not also earning a good income. At the time of making this video, I make just under $115,000 per year. That probably sounds like a lot of money to most people, but that's just about the average income for where I live. Remember, I live in a very expensive area, and I also earn a very generous matching contribution on all of my retirement contributions, which I absolutely maximize. So here's how it all breaks down. In terms of true income, by which I mean money that actually hit my bank account, I made $60,323.72. I use this money to pay my bills, but the other $40,000 all gets invested. $7,000 of that goes into my Roth IRA, and the rest of it goes into my personal brokerage. I also contribute the absolute max to my 401k, which last year was $23,000. But then my company contributes a lot more, which brings this up to $36,496.70. This is pretty insane. You will not see that many companies contribute that much money to a 401k. The reason that my company contributes so much is they don't give any stock options. So otherwise, I would not be earning such a big match. And then lastly, I sent $4,150 to my health savings account last year, which is the maximum I could contribute. So all total, that means I made $100,970.42 after taxes. My annual expenses are just 19.85% of that, which means I'm saving 80.15% of my income. This next year, hopefully I'll save even more. And I wanted to be super transparent about this because every video, there's usually one or two people who comment and say something like, the only reason you'll be able to retire so early is because you make so much money. And that is half true. But the average single person in the US still makes $57,694 after taxes. So even if I only earn $57,694 per year, and even though I live in an area that is 1.5 times as expensive as the national average, I still would be saving $37,649. That's still 65% of my income. So don't tell me that I'm only able to retire early because I earn so much money. A 65% savings rate is still good enough to retire after about 10 to 11 years of work. So if you're serious about reaching financial freedom, I can pretty much guarantee that just a few small changes could put you years closer to your goal. And if you still think that retiring early is impossible for regular people, you need to watch this video right here where I explain how to retire early as a regular person.